She built a sawdust fortress for $4. They were shocked it stayed warm. Gunnar Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Wisconsin winters and buried 2 neighbors who froze, told her plainly, "A widow cannot haul enough coal to heat a drafty shanty. You'll wake up frozen, and that boy will wake up dead beside you." She had $4, a 7-year-old son, and needed $12 of coal she could not afford. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. But 5 months earlier, Marta Koski had never built anything larger than a chicken coop. She stepped off the train in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1887. Emil clutched her hand. He was 7 years old and had not spoken since Milwaukee. The platform smelled of pine sap and sawdust. Mountains of it rose beyond the depot, great amber dunes taller than houses, the waste of 40 sawmills grinding through the northern forests. Somewhere in that chaos of lumber and men, her husband's cousin was supposed to meet her. She waited 3 hours. A station clerk finally told her. Henrik Koski had drowned in a log jam on the Wisconsin River 6 weeks prior. His body was never recovered. The letter of introduction Marta carried, the only connection she had to anyone within 1,000 miles, was addressed to a dead man. She had $11, a 7-year-old son, no family, no friends, no skills beyond cooking, cleaning, and the rough carpentry her father had taught her in Finland, enough to build a chicken coop or mend a fence, nothing more. The train back to Milwaukee cost $4. Milwaukee held nothing. The cramped room where Auntie had died of typhoid fever, the neighbors who had taken up a collection to send her away, the pitying looks she could not bear. She bought 2 meat pies from a vendor for 15 cents and found the road to the Brown Brothers sawmill. The mill foreman was a Swede named Gunnar Lindqvist, 58 years old, arms like timber beams, a face carved by 11 Wisconsin winters. He had built 14 houses in these woods. He had buried 2 neighbors who froze to death in the winter of 1882, found them in their cabin, sitting upright at the table, skin blue, a cold stove between them. He looked at Marta the way a man looks at a calf born too late in the season. "You can cook?" he asked. She nodded. 30 cents a day, room in the mill boarding house. The boy can stay. Mill closes November 1st. She did not ask what happened after November 1st. She already knew. The boarding house was a long, drafty building that shook when the saws screamed. She shared a room with Emil, 8 feet by 10 feet, a straw mattress on the floor, a window that let in more cold than light. The other rooms held mill workers, Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, Germans, single men mostly, a few families. All of them counting money against the coming winter. She worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, cooking for 40 men. The work was hot and endless. Breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6, dishes until 9. Her hands cracked from lye soap. Her back ached from standing. But at 30 cents a day, minus board, she could save. The math kept her awake at night. A winter's supply of coal, $12 to $15 for even a small shelter. Firewood, $3 to $4 per cord delivered, and a family needed 6 to 8 cords minimum. A stove, $8 to $12. Building materials for a basic claim shanty, $50 to $100. Food stores for winter, another $20. Total, roughly $100 to survive. She had $4.70 saved by mid-September. 6 weeks of labor had produced less than $5 above the cost of staying alive. At 30 cents a day, working every remaining day until the mill closed, she could earn perhaps $22 more. Her maximum possible savings, $27. She needed $100. The gap was $73. It might as well have been $73,000. Gunnar Lindqvist delivered his verdict on a September evening while she served supper. He did not address her directly. He spoke to the men at his table, loud enough for the room to hear. "The Finnish woman," he said. "She'll need to make a decision soon. A widow cannot haul enough coal to heat a drafty shanty. You'll wake up frozen, and that boy will wake up dead beside you." He took a bite of bread, chewed, swallowed. "She should find a husband among you lot, or take the train back to wherever she came from while she can still afford the ticket. Those are the choices. There aren't others." The room was silent. 30 men looked at their plates. None looked at Marta. She set down the stew pot, walked back to the kitchen, closed the door behind her, and stood in the dark with her hands pressed against the wall, breathing. Emil was asleep in their room upstairs. She thought of his face. She thought of Auntie, coughing blood onto the bedsheets in Milwaukee. She thought of the winter coming like a wave. Marry a stranger, surrender, or watch her son freeze. Those were the choices. There weren't others. She passed the ice house every morning walking to the mill kitchen. It was a squat building behind the main sawmill, built of rough planks with no windows and a single heavy door. Twice a year, men cut blocks from the frozen river and hauled them inside, packing them in sawdust. The ice was sold to hotels and meat markets in summer, a luxury that traveled by rail as far as Chicago. Marta had never thought about the ice house. It was just a building. Then one morning in late September, she stopped. The dawn was cold enough to see her breath. Frost traced the grass, but the ice inside that building had been cut in January. 8 months in a box, through spring thaw and summer heat, and the ice was still frozen. She stood there, staring at the rough plank walls. Sawdust. That was the only difference between the ice house and any other building. The walls were double. She could see where the inner and outer boards met at the corner, and between them, packed tight, 18 inches of sawdust. Nothing else. No magic. Just dead wood particles and the air trapped between them. If sawdust could keep cold in for 8 months against summer heat. She felt something shift in her chest. A door opening. She found Toivo Makinen behind the ice house that afternoon. He was 72 years old, a Finn from the same province as her father, the man who maintained the ice supply and kept the packing tight. His hands were gnarled as oak roots. His eyes were sharp. She asked him how it worked. He picked up a handful of sawdust and held it out. "You feel air," he said in Finnish. "All these little spaces. Air doesn't move heat. Hot air stays on the hot side. Cold air stays on the cold side. The more sawdust, the more air, the slower the heat moves." How slow? Slow enough that ice from January lasts until August. He dropped the sawdust and wiped his hand on his trousers. "Why do you ask?" she told him. The shelter she needed to build, the money she didn't have, the cold that was coming. Toivo listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody heats a house with sawdust," he said finally. "I know. The ice house keeps cold in. You want to keep cold out? It's not the same." "Why not?" He opened his mouth, closed it, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it is the same." The idea took shape in the dark. An ice house built to keep heat in instead of cold. Double walls with sawdust between them, not 18 inches but 24, as thick as she could build. A ceiling the same way. A floor over packed sawdust to stop the frozen ground from stealing warmth. No windows because glass bleeds heat. One door, tight as she could make it. If the walls were thick enough, how much heat would escape? A human body gave off warmth constantly. She knew this from sleeping pressed against Emil on cold nights. Two bodies in a small space, wrapped in blankets, breathing, living. Add a lamp burning oil. Add the warmth from cooking. Could it be enough? She had no way to know. No one had tried this. The idea felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, unable to see the bottom, but she could see the alternative. And the alternative was certain death. She found Ilmari Korhonen at the mill the next day. He was a Finnish carpenter, 41 years old, who had known her husband Antti in Milwaukee. He had helped her repair a broken shelf in the boarding house. He was the closest thing she had to a friend in Rhinelander. She told him her plan. He stared at her like she had proposed building a house out of butter. Sawdust, he repeated. Like the ice house, double walls, 24 inches of sawdust between them. The ice house keeps ice frozen. You want to keep people warm. Those are opposite things. The principle is the same. The sawdust stops heat from moving. Ilmari rubbed his face with both hands. He was a practical man. He built things that worked. This did not sound like something that would work. Sawdust settles, he said. By January, you'll have a foot of nothing at the top of your walls. All your heat will go straight out. I'll pack it tight. I'll add more before winter. Sawdust holds moisture. One leak, one crack in your roof, and it rots. Rotten walls collapse. You'll be buried alive. I'll mix it with lime. Lime dries it out and kills the mold. Sawdust burns. His voice rose. One spark from a stove and the whole thing goes up in minutes. You'd be building a coffin for you and your boy. I won't have a stove. Silence. You won't have a stove, Ilmari repeated slowly. A lamp, that's all. Body heat and a lamp. That's madness. Maybe. Nobody survives a Wisconsin winter on body heat. Nobody. Not ever. You need fire. Fire needs fuel. You're solving the wrong problem. Marta looked at him. Behind her, the wigwam burner roared, consuming mountains of sawdust the mill would otherwise have to pay to haul away. Free. Endless. Burning. The fuel I need is free, she said. It's sitting in a pile that reaches higher than the trees. I just have to figure out how to use it without burning it. Ilmari shook his head, but he didn't walk away. You'll die, he said. Probably. Your boy will die. Probably. Then why? She thought of the dining hall. Gunnar Lindqvist's voice carrying across the room, find a husband, or take the train back. The silence of 30 men agreeing. Because those aren't the only choices, she said. Not if I'm clever enough. Not if I'm willing to try something no one has tried. Ilmari stared at her for a long moment. You're mad, he said finally. Completely mad. He sighed. I'll help you find scrap lumber. The word spread. Not quickly. Marta told no one but Toivo and Ilmari. But in a mill town, nothing stays secret. The Finnish widow was building something strange. A shelter made of sawdust. A house with no stove. Opinions formed. Bets were placed. Men who had ignored her for weeks suddenly had things to say. She'll freeze before November. The walls will collapse by Christmas. Someone should stop her before she kills that boy. She heard them. She kept working. Harriet Olmsted heard too. Harriet was 52, the widow of Rhinelander's former coal merchant. She now ran a boarding house in town proper, not the mill's rough quarters, but a respectable establishment that catered to visiting businessmen and stranded travelers. She also ran an informal service, connecting widows with limited options to men seeking wives. Some called it charity. Others called it something else. Harriet charged for her introductions. She charged for the rooms where desperate women waited to be chosen. She charged for the food they ate while waiting. A widow without resources was a widow who would pay anything. A widow who built her own shelter and survived alone was a threat to the entire arrangement. Harriet came to the building site on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. Marta was alone. Ilmari was at the mill. Emil was with Toivo, helping stack icehouse supplies. The outer walls were half finished, a skeleton of scrap boards rising 7 feet from a sawdust-packed floor. It looked exactly like what it was, the desperate effort of someone with no money and no options. Harriet walked a slow circle around the structure. Her dress was clean. Her boots were polished. She looked like she had never lifted anything heavier than a teacup. "This is what all the fuss is about," she said. Marta kept nailing. "I must say I'm disappointed. I expected something more substantial. This looks like a very large chicken coop. Nail, hammer, nail. You know, winter will be here in 6 weeks. The boarding house closes in 3. Where will you sleep between then and whenever you finish this?" She gestured vaguely. "Project? I'll finish before then." "Will you? All alone?" Harriet smiled. "I've come to offer you a sensible alternative. My establishment has room for a hard worker. You could cook, clean, nothing beneath your dignity. In exchange, you'd have a warm room through the winter and an opportunity to meet the kind of respectable men who might offer a widow a future." She said respectable men the way someone might say livestock for sale. "No." "No?" Harriet's smile didn't waver. "That's hasty. Think of your boy. He deserves a proper home, a proper father. What you're building here, forgive me for saying, it's not a home, it's a fire waiting to happen. Thank you for your concern. My concern is genuine. That Finnish woman's sawdust shack burns down with her child inside. People will ask questions. They'll want to know who allowed it, who could have intervened." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marta set down her hammer. She turned to face Harriet fully. "Mrs. Olmsted," she said, "I will finish this shelter. I will live in it through the winter. If I freeze, that's my affair. If I burn, that's my affair. Either way, I will not be coming to your establishment. I will not be meeting your respectable men, and I will not be paying your prices." Something flickered across Harriet's face. Anger, quickly suppressed. "Pride freezes as fast as poverty, Mrs. Koski. Remember that when you're shivering in this pile of kindling you call a house. When you come crawling to my door, and you will, the price will be higher." She turned and walked away. Her boots left clean prints in the sawdust. 2 days later, the mill workers who had been bringing Marta scrap lumber stopped coming. 11 weeks had shrunk to 9. 9 weeks until the boarding house closed. No income. No help except Ilmary's spare hours. And now, no free materials. Marta went to the mill waste pile herself. The scrap lumber was still there, mountains of it, slabs and offcuts destined for the wigwam burner. She loaded her borrowed wheelbarrow and hauled it back to the building site. It took 4 hours to move what 2 men could carry in 30 minutes. She did it again the next day, and the next. The outer walls went up board by board. Each piece was a different length, a different width, cut from the curved edges of logs or rejected for knots or splits. She measured, sawed, fitted, nailed. Her shoulders burned. Her hands bled through the rags she wrapped them in. Emil helped when he could. He held boards steady. He passed nails. He brought water from the pump. He was 7 years old watching his mother work herself to exhaustion on something no one believed would succeed. "Mama," he said one evening, "will it be warm?" "I don't know," she told him. It was the only honest answer. The outer walls were finished on day 12. 4 walls of scrap boards, rough and mismatched but solid, rising 7 feet from the sawdust floor. A doorway gaped on the south side. Above, open sky. Now came the hard part. The inner walls had to be built 24 inches inside the outer walls. The same process, posts, boards, nails, but in a space barely wide enough to move. She crawled into the cavity between the walls, working in near darkness, nailing boards from the inside while sawdust rained into her hair. Day 13. Day 14. First frost. She woke on day 15 to ice on her water bucket. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. The boarding house windows showed white where breath had condensed and frozen. Winter wasn't coming. It was here. The inner walls were half finished. The sawdust fill hadn't started. The ceiling and roof existed only in her mind. She worked faster, 18 hours a day. Sleep became a luxury she borrowed from and never repaid. Her body started to fail. Her back seized on day 17, and she spent an hour on the ground, unable to stand, while Emil watched with terrified eyes. Ilmari found her there. "This is killing you," he said. "Not fast enough." She got to her feet. "Help me with the ceiling joists." He helped. He shouldn't have. He had his own work, his own concerns. But he helped. They raised the joists together, fitted them into notches she had cut in the wall plates. The ceiling frame went up in 2 days. Then the rain came. Day 23. A cold, soaking rain that lasted 36 hours. It flooded the sawdust pile at the mill, turning the dry insulation she needed into sodden mush. Wet sawdust was useless. It conducted heat instead of stopping it, and it would rot inside the walls. She stood in the rain, staring at the ruined pile. Her deadline was in 12 days. Half her work remained. The material she needed was destroyed. That night, she did not sleep. She sat on the boarding house floor and calculated. If she lost 2 days waiting for dry sawdust, then worked every remaining hour until eviction, could she finish? The numbers said no. The numbers had been saying no since August. She had stopped believing them. On day 26, a handcart appeared at the building site. Toivo Makinen pushed it. He was 72 years old, his back bent from decades of hauling ice, but he pushed that cart like it held nothing. It held 300 pounds of dry sawdust. "From the covered pile," he said, "behind the ice house. I keep a reserve." Marta stared at him. "This is half a day's work for me," she said. "You're saving me. 6 loads." He cut her off. "I brought 6 already. They're stacked behind your east wall." 6 loads. 3 days of hauling for a strong man. For a 72-year-old with a bad back, it must have taken most of a week. "Toivo, why?" He was quiet for a moment. His eyes, sharp as ever, held something she couldn't name. "Antikoski fixed my roof in Milwaukee," he said finally. 19 years ago. I had no money. He took nothing. Said a Finn doesn't let another Finn's roof leak. He turned the handcart around. A Finn doesn't let another Finn's widow freeze. She tried to give him her last 50 cents. He refused. He spoke one more sentence in Finnish. Something about her husband being a good man, and walked back toward the mill. Marta did not cry. She had no time. She mixed the sawdust with lime, 1 part lime to 12 parts sawdust, the ratio Toivo had told her killed rot and pests. She climbed into the wall cavity with buckets, spreading the mixture by hand, tamming it down until her arms ached, then climbing out and starting again. 3 walls filled by day 28. The 4th wall and ceiling by day 32. The roof went up on day 34. Sloped boards covered with tar paper, ugly but functional. She nailed the last piece in place as the sun set on October 27th. Move-in day, October 28th. The boarding house closed 3 days later. The shelter was finished, 8 feet by 10 feet. Walls 32 inches thick, 4 inches of board on each side, 24 inches of lime-treated sawdust between. A ceiling 2 feet thick, a floor over packed sawdust, one door stuffed with rags at the edges, no windows, no stove, no chimney. From the outside, it looked like a mistake, a child's drawing of a house, squat and windowless, crouching at the edge of the mill property like something ashamed of itself. Gunnar Lindqvist walked past it on October 29th and stopped. Marta was inside, arranging their bedding, 2 straw mattresses side by side, every blanket she owned layered on top. "You actually finished it," Lindqvist said through the door. She didn't answer. "Looks warm enough today, but today isn't winter." He paused. "November isn't winter either. Wait until January. Wait until the real cold." She still didn't answer. He walked away. The first night, the temperature outside dropped to 28 degrees, below freezing, cold enough to kill anyone caught without shelter. Inside the sawdust walls, Marta's breath did not fog. She lay in the dark with Emil pressed against her, the lamp burning low on its shelf. The air was cool, but not cold. The walls, when she touched them, felt faintly warm on the inside. She stayed awake for hours, waiting for the cold to find its way in. It never did. Emil slept through the night without shivering. In the morning, he asked for breakfast like it was any other day. The first week confirmed what the first night suggested. The shelter worked. 20 degrees outside, 35 outside, wind howling off the frozen lake, the interior stayed livable. Cool, yes, they wore their coats sometimes, but not the desperate breath-fogging cold of an unheated building. She tested it. One night, she let the lamp go out entirely. Darkness and silence, just 2 bodies under blankets. The temperature dropped inside, but did not plummet. By morning, it was cold enough to see her breath, but not cold enough to freeze water. 2 bodies generated heat. The sawdust walls held it in. The skeptics watched and waited. "November isn't winter," Gunnar Lindqvist repeated whenever Marta's survival came up in conversation. "Wait until 30 below," Ilmari Korhonen said, though he said it with less certainty each time. "No one survives 30 below without a stove." "She'll come crawling before Christmas," Harriet Olmsted predicted. "The price will be higher then." November became December. The snow deepened. The temperatures dropped, 10 below, 15 below. Marta added more sawdust through an access hatch near the ceiling, compensating for the settling Ilmari had warned about. She cleared snow from the roof daily, watching it pile against the walls. More insulation, she realized. The snow itself was helping. Inside the shelter, she and Emil lived. They ate meals of potatoes and dried fish. They read by lamplight from a water-damaged Bible she had found in the boarding house trash. They played games with pebbles on the floor. They slept pressed together under blankets that stayed warm all night. It was not comfortable. It was not easy. But it was not death. And then, in January, death came anyway. January 12th, 1888, dawned warm. Marta woke to the sound of water dripping. She lay still for a moment, confused. Water dripping meant thaw. Thaw meant temperatures above freezing in January in Wisconsin. She pushed open the door. The air that hit her face was soft, almost mild. 38 degrees, she guessed, warmer than most November days. The snow on the roof was melting, running down the tar paper in thin streams. The sky was pale blue, cloudless. Emil appeared at her elbow, squinting in the brightness. "Can I go outside?" She looked at him. He had been cooped up for weeks, venturing out only briefly when the cold allowed. His face was pale from lamplight living. His legs were restless. "Stay close," she said. "Don't go past the woodpile." He was gone before she finished speaking, running through the slush, kicking up sprays of wet snow. She watched him for a moment, her son, alive, healthy, playing in January sunshine that had no business existing. She hung blankets on a line to air out. She swept the floor. She melted snow for drinking water. The warmth felt like a gift, and she had learned not to waste gifts. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 40 degrees. Emil was still outside, building something from sticks and snow. Other children had emerged from other houses. She could hear their voices carrying across the mill property. The whole town seemed to exhale, releasing the tension of months of cold. At 1 o'clock, Marta noticed clouds on the northwestern horizon, dark clouds moving fast. She called Emil inside for lunch. At 2 o'clock, the temperature was 42 degrees. The clouds had grown into a wall, black and gray and green, stretching across the entire horizon, advancing like an army. At 2:15, the wind hit. It came without warning. One moment, still air. The next, a blast that knocked Emil's stick-and-snow construction flat and sent Marta stumbling against the door frame. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took to catch her breath. She grabbed Emil and pulled him inside, slammed the door, stuffed rags into every crack. Through the walls, she heard the wind rise from a howl to a scream. The blizzard arrived with a violence she had never experienced. Snow came sideways, horizontal, driven by winds that gusted to 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to nothing. She opened the door a crack and saw only white. A solid wall of white. The boarding house 100 yards away, completely invisible. The temperature fell like a stone dropped down a well. 40 degrees at 2 o'clock. 20 degrees by 3. 8 degrees by 4. 0 by 6. And still falling. Marta lit the lamp. The small flame seemed absurd against the howling chaos outside, but she needed every source of heat. She needed everything. Emil sat on the mattress, watching her with wide eyes. He had been outside when the storm hit, only for seconds, but long enough. His clothes were wet from the sudden snow, and he was shivering. She stripped off his wet things, wrapped him in every blanket, pulled him against her body, skin to skin, the way she had held him as an infant. "I'm cold, Mama." I know. His skin was clammy. His shivering was violent, his whole body shaking. She had seen this before in Milwaukee when a dock worker had fallen into the winter harbor and been pulled out too late. The shaking was the body trying to generate heat. When the shaking stopped, it meant the body had given up. She held him tighter. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the lamp flickered. The walls, her walls, the sawdust walls she had built with bleeding hands, stood between her son and the killing cold. The temperature at 9 o'clock was 18 degrees below zero. The temperature at midnight was 26 below. The walls held. She marked time by the lamp oil. The flame burned steady, consuming fuel, giving off its tiny warmth. She had positioned it as close as she dared. Too close, and the heat might reach the sawdust behind the boards, but she needed every calorie. Emil needed every calorie. His shivering had slowed by 10 o'clock. That terrified her. She talked to him constantly, Finnish fairy tales from her childhood, stories about his father, how Antti had courted her, how he had made her laugh, how he had carried Emil on his shoulders through the streets of Helsinki before they left for America. Memories she had kept locked away because they hurt too much. She unlocked them now, spending them like currency, anything to keep him present, keep him fighting. "Tell me about the boat," he whispered. She told him about the boat, the crossing from Finland, the storms that had made everyone sick, the first sight of land, how the passengers had crowded the rail, crying and laughing. "Tell me about Papa's laugh." She told him about Auntie's laugh, How it started low and built until his whole body shook. How he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. How she had fallen in love with that laugh before she fell in love with anything else. Emile's eyes drifted closed. "Stay awake," she said. "Emile, stay awake." "Tired, Mama." "I know, but you have to stay awake. Tell me a story. Tell me about your friend at the boarding house. Tell me about the game you played with the sticks." He mumbled something. His shivering had nearly stopped. The temperature outside was 30 degrees below zero. The wind had not let up. The snow was piling against the walls. She could hear it, a constant hiss of accumulation. The shelter creaked and groaned, but did not break. She pressed her mouth against Emile's chest and breathed. Warm breath, warm air, heat from her lungs directly onto his skin. She breathed on his face, his hands, his feet. She wrapped her body around him like a second skin. At 1 o'clock in the morning, his shivering stopped entirely. She did not sleep. She did not rest. She held him and breathed and prayed in Finnish, prayers she had not said since childhood, prayers her grandmother had taught her, prayers for warmth and life and morning. The lamp burned, the walls held, the cold tried to reach them and could not. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the temperature reached 34 degrees below zero. This was the bottom, the worst, the coldest night and the coldest storm in years, the night that would later be called the Children's Blizzard for all the school children who died walking home through weather they could not see. 34 degrees below zero, 76 degrees colder than the balmy afternoon when Emile had played in the melting snow. Inside the shelter, Marta touched the wall. Warm, still warm on the inside. Cold as ice on the outer board, she knew, but the 24 inches of sawdust between them stopped the cold, like a fortress stops an army. The heat from her body, from Emile's body, from the tiny lamp, it stayed. It accumulated. It held. She did not know the exact temperature inside the shelter. She had no thermometer, but she could breathe without seeing her breath fog heavily. The water in her cup was not frozen. Her fingers, when she pulled them from under the blankets, did not immediately go numb. 35 degrees inside, she guessed. Maybe 40. Cold enough to be uncomfortable. Not cold enough to kill. The shelter was working. Her design, the design everyone said was madness, the design that defied every rule of frontier survival, was working. Emile stirred against her chest. "Mama?" His voice was thin, weak, but present, alive. "I'm here." "I had a dream about Papa." "What did he say?" "He said to stay warm," she laughed. It came out as a sob. "That's good advice." She held him tighter. Outside, the wind still screamed. The temperature was still 34 below. Men were dying in their cabins 3 miles away, their fires gone out, their fuel exhausted. Families were huddling in houses that leaked heat like sieves, watching frost form on the inside of their windows, praying for dawn. And here, in a sawdust box built by a widow with $4, a mother and child stayed warm enough to live. The wind dropped at 5 in the morning. The silence was so sudden that Marta thought she had gone deaf. She lay still, holding her breath, waiting. Nothing. The constant howl that had filled the night was simply gone. Emile was asleep, real sleep, not the dangerous unconsciousness of hypothermia. His breathing was steady. His skin, when she touched his forehead, was warm. The fever that had spiked during the night had broken sometime before dawn. She eased away from him, moving slowly to avoid waking him. The blankets were damp with sweat, hers and his. But damp was fine. Damp meant warmth. Damp meant survival. She lit a second lamp and looked at the walls. No frost, no ice, The boards were dry. The sawdust behind them had held and held and held. She opened the door. White. A world of white, blinding after the lamplight darkness. Snow piled waist-high against the shelter, drifted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The sky was pale gray, still heavy with clouds, but the storm was over. The air was cold, still far below zero, but still. No wind, no horizontal snow, just cold and silence and the clean white aftermath. She waded through the drift to look at the rest of the town. The boarding house chimney was cold. No smoke. Either everyone had left, or they had burned everything they had and run out before dawn. The mill buildings were half buried in snow. The wigwam burner, which usually smoked constantly, sat dark and silent. Further away, toward town, other chimneys rose against the gray sky. Some were smoking, some were not. Gunnar Lindqvist came at noon. He walked through the chest-deep snow, like a man walking through water, slow and deliberate, his breath pluming in the still, frigid air. Behind him, the boarding house had come back to life. Someone had restarted the fires. Smoke rose from the chimney. But the look on his face said the news was not all good. He stopped in front of the shelter, looked at it, looked at the door where Marta stood with Emil wrapped in blankets behind her. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." He stood there for a long moment. His face worked through emotions she couldn't name, disbelief, confusion, something that might have been shame. "Peter Gustafsson is dead," he said finally. "Farm 3 miles north. Fire went out sometime after midnight. They found him frozen at his table." Marta said nothing. "The Henriksen children lost fingers. Frostbite. Their cabin dropped below zero inside even with the fire burning. Mrs. Carlson nearly died. Johansson broke down her door and carried her to his house." He looked at the shelter again, at the thick walls, at the doorway where no cold seemed to seep through. "My house burned through nearly a cord of wood last night. We ran out of seasoned logs at 2 in the morning, had to burn green wood, smoked so bad we could barely breathe. Temperature inside dropped to 20 degrees anyway. My children slept in their coats." He stepped closer, put his hand on the outer wall, pulled it back. The boards were cold as ice. "Can I come inside?" Marta stepped aside. Gunnar Lindqvist entered the sawdust shelter. He stood in the center of the 8x10 room, turning slowly, taking in the double walls, the thick ceiling, the lamp burning on its shelf. The air inside was cool but not cold, 50 degrees perhaps, warming now that the worst had passed. He put his hand on the interior wall. "It's warm," he said. His voice was strange, hushed, almost reverent. "The outside is frozen solid, and the inside is warm. The sawdust stops the heat from moving. You had no fire?" "No." "No stove?" "No. Just bodies and a lamp." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. His hand stayed on the wall as if he needed to keep touching it to believe it was real. "I built 14 houses," he said finally. 14. None of them held warmth like this. He turned to face her. "I told you a widow couldn't survive. I told you that boy would freeze. I was wrong." It was not an apology. Frontier men did not apologize. But it was an admission, and from Gunnar Lindqvist, that was worth more. "A woman alone built something I never could have imagined," he said. "I was wrong." He left without another word. But by evening, 3 families had come to see the shelter, and Marta had explained the design 3 times, and the word had begun to spread. They came in waves over the following weeks. First the curious people who had heard the story and wanted to see if it was true. They touched the walls, asked questions, shook their heads in disbelief. A shelter heated by body warmth. Impossible. Except here it was. Then the desperate, families who had burned all their fuel in the blizzard and faced weeks of winter with empty woodsheds. Could they build something like this? How thick did the walls need to be? Where did she get the sawdust? Marta answered every question. She showed them the wall cavity, the lime-treated sawdust, the way she had packed it tight and topped it off when it settled. She explained the ice house, Toivo's wisdom, the principle of dead air that didn't move heat. She charged nothing. She turned no one away. Why? Ilmari Koronen asked her one afternoon, after she had spent 3 hours explaining the design to a Swedish family with 5 children and no fuel. Because Toivo helped me, she said. Now I help others. Ilmari had come to measure. He brought paper and a pencil, carefully recording dimensions, sawdust depths, the ratio of lime. His objections from the fall, the settling, the fire risk, the moisture, he now catalogued as problems she had solved. The settling happened, he admitted, but you added more. The hatch was clever. Toivo's idea. The fire risk, the lime helps, the tight packing helps. No open flame near the walls helps more. I was careful. You were right. He looked up from his notes. I said nobody heats a house with body warmth. I was wrong. You didn't heat a house. You stopped the cold from stealing the warmth that was already there. He asked permission to copy the design. She granted it. By spring, he had added sawdust-filled walls to his own cabin, and the difference, he told her, was like living in a different climate. The spread happened without planning. 3 families in Rhinelander built sawdust additions before the winter ended, not complete shelters like Marta's, but extra walls around existing rooms, retrofits that cut their fuel consumption in half. 2 widows, women in circumstances nearly identical to Marta's own, came to learn the method and built small shelters of their own the following summer. The mill started setting aside clean, dry sawdust in a covered pile. Workers could take it free. They called it Koski sawdust, though Marta always corrected them. It wasn't hers. It was Toivo's. It was Frederick Tudor's. It was anyone who had ever packed ice in sawdust and noticed it stayed frozen. By the following winter, 7 families in Rhinelander used some form of sawdust insulation. By 1890, the number had spread to a dozen buildings across the northern Wisconsin timber towns. The technique moved through the Finnish and Scandinavian immigrant communities, passed by word of mouth, demonstrated by example, trusted because the people sharing it had no reason to lie. Marta never wrote it down. She drew no plans. She claimed no invention. The knowledge passed the way all practical knowledge passed on the frontier, from hand to hand, from one desperate person to another. Harriet Olmsted never acknowledged what had happened. She continued to predict doom. Next winter will be worse. She was lucky. It can't last. But her predictions grew quieter as the months passed. 2 widows who might have come to her boarding house, who might have paid her prices and considered her gentlemen, had instead built their own shelters and survived on their own terms. By spring, Harriet had stopped speaking of Marta Koski entirely. 4 years after the blizzard, Marta married Ilmari Korhonen. The wedding was small. A Finnish pastor, a handful of mill workers, Emil serving as ring-bearer at 11 years old. They built a house together on a lot Ilmari had purchased at the edge of town. It was a proper house, with windows and a stove and a chimney. The walls were double, filled with sawdust, just like the shelter that had saved her life. Marta lived in that house for 33 years. She outlived Ilmari by 17 of them, cooking for herself, tending a garden, becoming one of those old Finnish women who seemed as permanent as the pine forests around them. The town changed. The mills closed. The lumber ran out. New industries came and went. But Marta remained. She died in 1924, in her bed, in the house she had helped build. Emil Koski grew to adulthood. Married a Swedish woman, worked at the Brown Brothers mill for 30 years until it closed. Behind his own house, he kept a workshop with double walls and sawdust insulation. He never explained why to his children. Some things didn't need explaining. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, the temperature in Rhinelander, Wisconsin was 22 degrees below zero. It had been 34 below at 3 in the morning. The wind had gusted to 60 miles per hour. The storm that would kill over 200 people across the northern plains had dropped temperatures more than 70 degrees in less than a day. Gunnar Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Wisconsin winters and built 14 houses, had looked at Marta Koski in September and delivered his verdict. A widow cannot haul enough coal to heat a drafty shanty. You'll wake up frozen, and that boy will wake up dead beside you. Marta Koski did not haul coal. She hauled sawdust instead. Free, endless, the waste of 40 mills, the mountains of it that rose higher than houses, that everyone else burned because they didn't know what else to do with it. She did not heat a drafty shanty. She built walls so thick the cold could not reach through them. 24 inches of dead air trapped in sawdust, stopping heat the way a dam stops water. She did not wake up frozen. She woke up warm enough to save her son's life. On the morning of January 13th, Marta Koski opened the door of her sawdust shelter and looked out at a world buried in white. Smoke rose from chimneys across the town, the survivors, burning whatever they had left, trying to warm houses that leaked heat through every board. Her shelter had no chimney. It had never needed one.